I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to our special program from China's tropical province of Hainan, the site of the annual conference of Boao Forum for Asia. Shared future, converted to action, common development. Those can be abstract phrases, but one might not want to miss the real momentum behind them. That is especially true if you are looking at the world's economic and trade landscapes. They are changing and fast. But beneath the hustle and bustle of the world's headlines, what's the essence of all the changes? Today, let's hear insights from some leading figures in the world. Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, and Leslie Mesdorf, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank. Both of them are in the front line of the latest multilateral platforms, crucial for our world today, and are also charismatic thinkers from the field.
Will globalization turn the world upside down?
Is Asia in concert or in division?
China's economy is slowing down, but should it be?
If the economy revolves around technology, how will technology change the world?
We ask politicians, entrepreneurs, thinkers, and creators for answers that will shape our future. Join CGTN special coverage in Boao.
First, my conversation with Pascal Lamy, the former WTO Director General. We have conversations several times a year, but this time I was struck by his tone of both urgency and calmness in front of the heated debate of WTO reform and China-U.S. trade relations. Let's listen in. Mr. Lamy, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing. I guess we have to continue our conversation about the trade disputes. So what do you make of the latest development? It seems that both sides have been putting a lot of efforts into the negotiation itself.
Yeah, I think for the moment, the game is as if US, China, EU, Japan were looking to improve the WTO by reforming it. Now, I'm quite sure that this is the EU stance, that this is the Japanese stance, that this is the Chinese stance. I'm not sure about the US stance. But whether the US are really trying to negotiate improvements or whether they are trying to demand things which they know is not possible, to be able at the end of the day to say, we told you this is not reformable and we have to kill the system, I don't know. But I think we Europeans, together with Japan, to try and keep US in the tent and bring China more into the tent, which means that on both sides, including on the Chinese side, they will have to accept a bit more disciplines in WTO in some areas, such as, for instance, subsidization, which, by the way, seems to fit with this new concept which has been floated here in Beijing of competitive neutrality, which I understand as readiness to level the playing field between the state-owned enterprises and private sector.
But Mr. Lamy, aren't we facing the danger that even the global trade system is to collapse very soon because of the dispute settlement area would not work as a result of the appellate body dysfunctioning? Are we going to face some very different crisis in nature, in fact?
I don't think so. I don't think so, although I recognize that the US have taken the dispute settlement of WTO hostage. I think there are various ways to fix this problem.
Like what?
Like, for instance, a majority decision to appoint judges, which by the statute of WTO seems to be possible. For example, in addressing a number of problems which the US have with the dispute settlement system. If the US believe the judges over-interpreted the WTO law. When they lost cases, by the way, they never believe they interpreted wrongly the WTO when they win cases. Mm-hmm. It's only when they lose cases. Let's assume they may be right. This is perfectly addressable. But for the moment, the US have not shown their hands. They haven't said, this is what we want from a reform of the dispute settlement system and of the appellate body. So until and unless we have a clear view of what they want, it's going to be difficult. But I think the system can live while a negotiation on how to improve the appellate body takes place.
Can WTO afford the U.S. walk away? Since that is a catchphrase, it seems that President Trump has been very fascinated about.
I agree with that. He has been threatening to quit the WTO. Whether this is serious or not, I don't know. I think this would be at a huge cost for the U.S. economy. Think, for instance, a moment that they would lose the protection of the TRIPS agreement, the WTO agreement that protects U.S. intellectual property worldwide, would disappear, and U.S. IP would only be enforced within the U.S. territory. That would be a huge damage for the U.S. economy. So I don't think it will happen. I think this is bluff, but in case it would happen, we have to be ready to think about a WTO minus the US. We can perfectly think of a WTO without the US. Mr. Trump says to everybody, my way or no way. This is not acceptable.
Now you see, Mr. Lamy, a lot of active diplomacy taking place between China and the European countries. Chinese president visit to Italy, France, for example, the European Commission's discussion about their so-called possibly coordinated China approach. How much do you think these will really bring China and the European countries, I mean the European capitals, and the EU together about a consensus about trade and about the future of trade?
I think EU, like Japan, by the way, is trying to remain somewhere in between US and China. They are trying to mediate, and if you look at what has been tabled in the WTO negotiations, some proposals are sponsored by US, EU, Japan, others are sponsored by EU and China. So EU is trying to put pressure on China with the US and put pressure on US with China. And the reason for that is very simple. US or China may think bilateralism is good for them. They have the capacity to do that. They are big, they are powerful, they have big armies, they have big defense systems, they have big diplomatic systems, they are strong. EU or Japan, by the way, cannot afford bilateralism. They are, in a way, too weak. They only have the multilateral option. And this leads them to try and make sure that we keep a multilateral trading system. So on this, I think China has expressed the view that they won't go bilateral, although trying to cook a deal with the US, which might have a rather bilateral smell. We will see what's in there, whether it's just a bit of managed trade, because Mr. Trump likes exports and not imports, so he thinks the US-China trade balance should be fixed. Maybe it will reduce the US-China trade imbalance and increase the US trade imbalance with other countries, which is likely to happen in my view. But whether or not this addresses structural problems is an open question. No, there's nothing like a bilateral subsidy. So if it's a question of China accepting steps forward, more disciplines on subsidies, these are of a multilateral nature, not of a bilateral nature.
Not only the existing international system, but also some of the new mechanisms. I'm sure, Mr. Lamy, you've been hearing a lot about discussions and debates about Belt and Road Initiative. That's about connectivity that, of course, will have an impact and being impacted by trade. So, Mr. Lamy, what do you make of this fierce debate going on about the nature of the BRI?
No, I think it's a very powerful initiative that could fill a gap in international cooperation, which is that there is not enough investment in infrastructures. Yeah. We know that whether it's about transport, energy, water, this planet is short of infrastructures. So in many ways, this is a good thing to do. Now, problem, I think, is that so far it has been seen as a sort of one-way street. It's China who decides, China who puts the money on the table, Chinese companies who build and operate these systems. So there will have to be, in my view, in the future, a bit more feeling of reciprocity, and I think under these conditions, it can benefit everybody, and it deserved to be pushed, provided, again, it's not seen as one-sided.
About technology, China and Italy's cooperation, for example, about technologies, that was quite a debate if you look at the press coverage over the past few days. So will EU be able, or European capitals be able to make its own independent decisions, rather be free from all the obligations that others try to set on them? That's a big question mark too, isn't it?
I think EU is moving in a direction of more coordinated approach vis-à-vis China. None of EU countries today is able by itself to establish a balanced cooperation situation with China. China is too big, too strong. So the only way for the Europeans to be on par with China is to unite and have common positions. Which is why, for instance, the French president asked Chancellor Merkel and the president of the EU Commission to attend one of the discussions he's having with President Xi to give a signal that there are now coordinated EU positions. I think it's inescapable. And by the way, I think if China wants EU to be stronger to defend the multilateral system, you need a strong EU to do that. So, you cannot have it both ways.
So, Mr. Lamy, as you may know, China celebrated 40 years of reform and opening up. This year, China's 70th anniversary. So there is a lot of discussion about the path that we have taken and what can we learn, lessons and experiences. From a trade expert's perspective and from your personal interaction with your Chinese friends, any specific thoughts could be as inspiration?
I think what the experience of these last 40 years has shown, like, by the way, what the whole of the Chinese history has shown, is that when China opens, it's good for China.
Yeah.
When China closes, it's bad for China. China has been the major world economy for 15 centuries since the beginning of the Christian era. It disappeared from the world economy domination during roughly 250 years when it closed its economy. And I think this is exactly what Deng Xiaoping had in mind when he said we have to reopen in order to become again a major world economy. So this is what history tells us. And I think this is the big lesson. You need to open to grow.
Yeah.
China did that. It worked incredibly well. So well that I personally don't think it's replicable anywhere else. I do not agree that there is a Chinese model that others should imitate or emulate. It's a very specific situation, not least because of the size of the country. So reforming, opening is the way to go. That's the big lesson. And so far, China did it in a way that is more rational, with less accidents than in other continents. Now, does this mean that everything is fine? No, because the sort of convergence which Deng Xiaoping had initiated, and which lasted roughly from the 80s to the mid-2000, has changed at that time. With the economic crisis, China regrew the part of its economy which is under state command, and this part is less efficient, less productive than the private sector. And this is something that I think now needs to be addressed. There's been a lot of talk about reform and opening up and celebrating these 40 years and these 70 years. What we need is a bit of work. I think recent decisions, including this legislation on foreign investment, are in the right direction. More to come, in my view.
That's Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of WTO. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, from the annual forum in Boao. Coming up, my one-on-one interview with Leslie Masdorf, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank. How are emerging economies looking at the latest momentum in trade? Can they come to a consensus about future development paths? Coming up right after this. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. This program is coming to you from Boao at the Annual Forum for Asia. Emerging economies are a unique phenomenon coming onto the world stage since the last financial crisis in 2008. They are efficient in forming mechanisms to work multilaterally both between and among themselves. The New Development Bank is such an entity. All the 5 emerging economies, BRICS members, have equal share in the bank and make shared decisions for themselves. Leslie Masdorf, the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank, briefed me how this multilateral development bank sees the latest, such as China-U.S. trade negotiations and many other issues. Mr. Masdorf, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, China has been, since last year, announcing a series of financial sector openness policies. How is that likely to have an impact on the emerging economies that your organization is dealing with?
I think these are very significant announcements. I mean, as you know, the last 40 years of reform and opening up has been a very successful era in China's history, producing major economic benefits in terms of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, producing a manufacturing hub and creating this export-oriented global economy. But during this time, one of the real weaknesses of that period is that the financial sector and the capital markets remain substantially closed. So it's a bit of a contradiction, if you like, the economy globalizing, but one major segment of the economy being much more inward-looking. The next phase of what's called greater opening up, as you can see from the theme here at the China Development Forum, is about facilitating the liberalization of the capital markets. So that is going to be a major stimulus for the next phase of Chinese growth. Why do I say that? I say that because there's likely to be significant capital inflows over the next number of years to come. I'll give you one concrete example. The China interbank bond market, or the Chinese bond market, is substantially domestic, 98% domestic. As China now opens up access, and for example with Bond Connect, there'll be greater inflows of institutions buying bonds in the Chinese market going forward.
Yeah.
I guess I'm saying there is significant inflows for new investment coming into China.
Right.
The second point to make very quickly is that the foreign investment law that has just been passed is going to help facilitate that inflow.
Yeah.
Because there's greater certainty now, greater predictability about the environment that foreign investors come into. For example, the protection of intellectual property. Firms have always been concerned about whether there will be forced technology transfer to domestic companies. And in the trade dispute, as you know, between China and the US, this issue has been raised. Now there's a law that sets very clearly and gives the protection to foreign investors.
Right.
In some, there's going to be major economic benefits that will flow from this period of greater opening up.
Right. One point that you have just mentioned about the openness of the market, do you think many have got the message, though, that many have a sophisticated understanding of the series of measures of opening up in the financial sector since last year? I'm afraid there has been some deficit of information so far.
Yeah. Look, I think the important point here to make is that the reforms are not being introduced in a big bang fashion. One of the hallmarks and one of the key features of Chinese policy over the last 40 years, and continues to be the case, is a gradual incremental approach. So it is not going to be a series of measures that will be introduced in 1 or 2 years. It's going to be a multi-year strategy. The reason why it cannot be done overnight is because you can have lots of instability and volatility in capital flows, for example.
Right.
You can have major capital outflows if suddenly all capital controls are removed. So the policy measures and the impact of it is not fully understood yet, but I'm saying the direction of change is going to be positive, because there are many developed countries that have followed a similar path, where initially the markets remain closed as companies are ready for emerge out of the protectionist environment, ready to face global competition.
Right.
That is what is happening to China's financial sector now. You will find the big banks, the big asset managers, the big even the rating agencies.
They're very eager.
They are coming in and will establish, without the now having to do local partnerships with joint ventures. Yeah.
Well, of course, we are talking about two tracks. One is, of course, China is further committed to reform and opening up. Yeah. On the other hand, it is also fighting 3 battles, which includes a battle against the financial risks. Yeah. Now, how should we understand the two sides of this argument? How that can be balanced well?
This is where smart regulation and having very effective prudential financial regulation in place. And that's also, as I said earlier on, you cannot just simply in one fine day wake up and
everything's resolved.
Remove all capital controls. You need to find the balance between trying to insulate the economy from the vulnerabilities and the risks that come with being fully integrated in global markets. So the key thing is to find the balance in the way that the regulatory environment is put in place.
And the other thing, of course, is about the competitiveness of the Chinese financial entities. If you look at the banks, they were already on their way a few years ago to become commercial banks, and they are now becoming some of the world's largest. Yeah. So if policies are being eased, not only for foreign investors, but also for these banks to do their own businesses globally, yeah, we do not know who is going to be more competitive, do we?
Right. That's exactly right.
That's an interesting thing, isn't it?
That is exactly right. Look, these banks will be, as they now will face domestic competition. Remember, they grew and expanded. All these large banks, Bank of China, ICBC, Agricultural Bank of China, all of them grew in an environment where they were effectively protected. They're state-owned banks, but they did not have competition from the foreign institutions. The next phase is going to be defined. They will also have to kind of relook at their business models, ensure that they become more efficient, make sure that they reduce non-performing loans in their books. A whole series of things will need to be done for them to effectively manage their risks.
You see the debate these days about geopolitics, about the world at a critical juncture. How will all these factors have an impact on the decision-making process and the eventual results of the decisions from your organization?
Thanks for that question, Tian, because it's very important to emphasize that multilateral development banks, by definition, have long-term, long-range lenses. So we do infrastructure finance. We provide loans to build bridges, ports, telecoms infrastructure, highways, and so on. These are long-term projects that typically 10, 12, 15 years. So we have the benefit of taking long-term views. Short-term cyclical dynamics naturally matter, but we are not driven by short-term profitability of what's happening in the next quarter in the economy. We factor those things, we take into account those variables, but we look at the world through sort of 15, 20-year lenses. Our projects are focused on ensuring we have developmental impact. and that we are financially sustainable rather than short-term profitability.
If you're talking about 15 to 20 years, Leslie, I have to ask you about this because there's likely to be some great change when it comes to sizes of the economies that we're talking about today, and also maybe a share of responsibilities among different economies in 15 to 20 years.
Absolutely.
China, US, just two examples. So how will that have an impact on your evolving policy, though with the mission clearly in mind?
So the New Development Bank right now comprises of 5 systemically important emerging markets.
Right.
The bank is going to, over time, also expand when we get the mandate from our Board of Governors, and will become a bigger emerging markets institution. Emerging markets are still moving up the curve in terms of putting in place the necessary infrastructure in form of ports, rail, highways, roads, and so on. That will continue over the next 10, 15 years. So there's a demand, a continuous demand for what we do, which is infrastructure finance. And that is not going to go away anytime soon. So hopefully over the next 10, 15, 20 years, some of these economies will reach moderately prosperous status, if you like, and move towards a state where they are no longer borrowing members from the bank. That is really our ideal, that at some stage the BRICS countries will become like European countries now. They are non-borrowing members. They're part of the international system, but they contribute in other forms rather than borrow for building infrastructure.
We're looking forward to that day. It means
Absolutely.
those economies are developing fast. Talking about the real state of the economies, there have been recent debates about developing versus emerging economies, developed economies. What do they really mean? Now, there is a standard very clearly mapped out in OECD's standard, but we also see some emerging economies, as a result of recent political changes, aspire to be an economy of a different state. So to you, what does that mean, this noises or voices around?
As emerging markets, all of our countries aspirationally would like to become developed economies, or fully industrialized economies, right, where you have more mature societies, your infrastructure is fully developed, your education and health, your soft infrastructure is all very much in place, and through technological advances you're able to develop more your services sector, which is where most of these developed economies, the major contributors to growth. We are still a long way from, as emerging markets, achieving that status. We are well on a path towards that status. There are a number of developing countries that are no longer major borrowers from the global multilateral system. So at some stage we want our countries to graduate.
Right.
But we are not close to that stage yet, because we still have significant gaps, infrastructure gaps, gaps in the quality of healthcare, quality of education, because it's not enough having the hard infrastructure. Soft infrastructure, strong technology platforms, having high quality and making use of digital education, digital health technologies. So embracing the possibilities of what new technologies offer is going to be part of that process of becoming a more developed nation.
The New Development Bank has been very keen to bring in the green factor, both the green bond and also the projects that you've been working on. Tell me about what could be the latest, because now we see the world is moving so much to geopolitics that some of the most important concepts, including green, sometimes being ignored.
Green is a fundamental characteristic of the ingredients of what the New Development Bank is trying to build. I'll give you an example. The bank in every respect is trying to ensure that we contribute towards environmental sustainability. Firstly, it's in our legal documents, in our founding articles of agreement, where the bank's mandate is defined as sustainable development. So if you build a port, if you build a rail line, if you build a road, everything we have to ensure that we are reducing carbon emissions. We believe, and there are already very clear signs, that over time, capital markets will be willing to pay a premium for companies and for banks that are more sustainable. So we believe that our credit quality as a bank will be higher over time if our portfolio is mainly green. So the risks that we will be exposed to as a bank medium term will be lower than a bank with, let's say, a much more carbon-intensive footprint.
That sounds a great idea, but Leslie, you know, at times when there are difficulties and challenges, people sometimes prioritize their tasks differently, particularly when you see the slowdown of the economies among the emerging economies. So do you think green will still be the priority? Will priority be re-streamlined, what we are talking?
That's a very interesting question, because what I sense now, and certainly from the public policy pronouncement, not just of Chinese policymakers, but also in some of the other countries, they see this opportunity of the slowdown to ensure that we leverage and make use of the new technologies that could enable growth in the future. I guess what I'm saying is this. Let's take the automobile market, right? There's a slowdown. If you just look at the numbers in China and many of our countries, because of the economic growth slowing down, fewer people are buying cars. However, the numbers of electric vehicles, the production of electric vehicles, China is already the biggest market in the world. In many of our countries, consumers are beginning, the demand and uptake is much higher. So green innovation is seen as a catalyst for the next growth phase. So as the economies are slowing down now, there's a search for where the next potential breakthrough could be in the green technologies.
Yeah.
Let's take battery storage, for example, which is at the heart of the electric vehicle market. That industry is going to lead to major structural transformation, and it could be an impetus and a stimulant for new economic growth. So because we're slowing down, green might lose its flavor of the month status, but at the same time, with these technological breakthroughs, it could in fact be the sort of secret ingredient that could produce that new sources of growth.
Over the past few years, there are so many debates, but at the same time, you see so many ideas of alternatives. Your new development bank is certainly one of those alternatives, accompanying or accommodating the earlier inventions, whether it's the World Bank or some of the others. But what's ahead? If you look at it, Leslie, the emerging economies, they individually have their own election cycle, and there are political changes within these economies already. Meanwhile, you also see the bigger environment, whether it's in their regions or globally. Things are becoming a bit different.
Yeah.
How will they be able to work together and also be able to see what their real consensus be for the future? I think that's an interesting question. As one that is running it, I'm sure you're thinking about it every day and discuss with them on a very frequent basis.
There are clearly shifts taking place in the global economy, politically and otherwise. As I said, we are very focused on ensuring that we keep our lenses firmly on the long term. By definition, the realignment that happens politically within regions, within regional blocks. A new regional bloc was formed in Latin America, for example, a few days ago, excluding some countries. So these dynamics we have to take into account. But fundamentally, we've got to be focused on what that medium-term agenda is. And as a bank, as I said, we have the luxury of having our entire activities is focused on that longer-term horizon.
That's Leslie Mastorp, the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the new Development Bank. That is all the time we have for today. Before we go, I will leave you with a short piece of my observations, trying to make sense of the latest happenings for your critique. This is me, Tian Wei, bidding you goodbye in Boao. See you tomorrow. This week, Italy was the first among the G7 countries to sign up for Belt and Road Initiative. The Memorandum of Understanding includes 29 agreements between the two countries that were worth 2.5 billion euros, according to Italy. France, one of the leading voices in Europe, has rolled out the red carpet for the Chinese delegation as we speak. In late April, just a few weeks from now, The BRI Forum will take place in Beijing. Various heads of state from economies of different sizes and shapes are going to join the discussion on win-win cooperation. European cooperation and the BRI Forum are only part of the many things evolving all at the same time. As they say, where there's no vision, there's no hope. Obviously, different capitals are taking note of that and tweak their policies at a time of dramatic change. But make no mistake, it is nothing like the Cold War, and it shouldn't be. Nobody enjoys being forced to choose sides or be dominated by others, with one after another, with to-do or not-to-do lists. The world has become a different place, and people aspire to be better. At least we hope so. Rather than rolling out and rolling back the Iron Curtain, people want a shared future. That's why a logo like this, Shared Future, Converted Action, and Common Development, becomes a brand name to attract many from around the world to brainstorm what's next. But one would not see the bigger picture without diligent observation. One has to admit, many do have sharp eyes when it comes to their plan to work with China. Since late last year, Beijing announced a series of opening up policies in the financial sector. Early in March, during China's annual political season, lawmakers approved the foreign investment law. It is the first update of similar laws since the beginning of China's reform and opening up 4 decades ago. Most recently, the China Development Forum in Beijing, an annual gathering of top global 500 companies to update their understanding of China, has attracted a 20% increase in attendance of global CEOs. Now, in the tropical city of Boao, the annual conference of the Boao Forum for Asia again emphasized consensus from the region and beyond. If you talk to participants of both conferences, many are talking specifically about how to best carry out the latest policies and how to do better together. One could argue it would be a pity to lose sight of all these, and the latest developments, the gathering momentum, as they need to be recognized, encouraged, and nurtured. While China and U.S. negotiators head back to talks this week in Beijing, they are taking constructive steps to build confidence. But that is not enough, given all I mentioned earlier. This year celebrates the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. 7 decades ago, many countries could not make their decision as to how to deal with the new country, particularly the United States. There was even a question confounding policymakers in Washington then: who lost to China? That question has a lot to do with whether Washington was really sophisticated and diligent enough to pick up the changes going on in China. At the very beginning of China's reform and opening up process 4 decades ago, a Swiss elevator company from Europe was the first one to establish a real joint venture with China, not the U.S. Later, Deng Xiaoping made the most well-known tour to southern China in 1992. That visit is now believed by many as China clearly making its attitude clear to the world that the country is serious in pushing for greater reform and opening up again. But American businesses and the administration then was also slow to recognize the change and determination in the public then, now looking at those days in retrospect. I remember someone quipping, saying, "History never says goodbye. History says, see you later." Let's hope this time around we're all smarter students of history and do not lose China the opportunities and visions again. I'm Tian Wei, and this is With the World from Boao.